I'm Victoria Stevens, and welcome to this podcast, Stock Exchanges. In my day job working as a fund manager at Lion Trust, investing on behalf of our clients in UK stock market listed companies, I'm fortunate enough to cross paths with some of Britain's most inspiring entrepreneurs. It's a huge privilege to sit across the table from the people who've put their heart and soul into growing and running companies. And in this series, I want to share that privilege with you, our listeners. As my guest on the podcast today, I'm delighted to host Tim Warrillow, the Chief Executive and co-founder of Fever Tree Drinks. In the 2 decades since it launched, Fever Tree has grown into one of Britain's most recognisable brands. The company started life in the early 2000s when, having spotted a gap in the market, Tim and his business partner Charles Rolls founded the company on the premise of selling high-quality, premium tonic water to partner with those increasingly high-end gins which were gaining in popularity. Fever Tree's since grown to be the #1 mixer brand in the UK by value and has expanded the product range to span flavoured tonics, gingers, sodas, adult soft drinks and premium cocktail mixers. As an illustration of the breadth of its range, when I type Fever Tree into my Ocado shopping app, it now returns over 50 results. Alongside range extension has been international expansion as a critical lever of growth. The brand's now sold in over 90 markets around the world, and the US, where Fever Tree already enjoys #1 market positions in tonic water and ginger beer, has overtaken the UK as the company's largest revenue segment. Tim is the quintessential British entrepreneur, and I'm so excited for him to share his story on the podcast today. Thanks so much for joining me, Tim.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and fantastic to welcome you to the Fever Tree offices.
Absolutely. So we're here in Fever Tree's offices in Hammersmith. It's an old converted school. Tim's just been telling me all about how it's critical at the moment to think about preserving that culture, and no better place to be recording today than Fever Tree's offices here. So to kick us off, Tim, I always like to go back to the start of a career, the beginning of someone's journey. So I wanted to ask you whether or not you always knew you had an ambition to start your own business. Did you always know that you had an entrepreneurial mindset?
Well, whether I knew it or not, I think it was perhaps no surprise looking back on it, because I grew up in a very entrepreneurial household. My father set up a very entrepreneurial business with my uncle when I was very young. This was an insecticide business, and they were selling, their market was the Middle East and the mosquito-ravaged parts of Africa. So I grew up with conversations around the kitchen table of these extraordinary exploits of Dad being run out of Yemen with someone with, a machete, or getting involved in some military coup they didn't know about in some wild part of Africa. So, these were the tales that, I was hearing around the table, which were very exciting to hear as a young boy. So I suppose that left a notable impression. And then I suppose, for me, my sort of turning point was at university. I went and studied business and marketing, but I've been doing lots of catering and waitering in university holidays, like lots of my friends. And a friend and I realised, actually, that so many of our friends have been waitering, that why wouldn't it be a good idea to go and rent them out to the local catering companies? And so we started this business there. And actually, small as it was, but it grew. We even opened an office up in Edinburgh, and it formed my dissertation. And I always remember my tutor saying, well, I think there's only one thing you're going to end up doing, which is starting your own business. And I was ever written a dissertation on a business they've started before. So I suppose that was the start of it. So as I say, no necessary surprise that this is what I've ended up doing.
Wow, an amazing backstory, and certainly entrepreneurial ambitions from a very young age there. Let's take you to when you met Charles then. So you are after university, you've kind of been and done that first entrepreneurial venture in waitering. But I think from what I've read anyway, meeting Charles was a real pivotal moment for you in terms of getting the very concept of Fever Tree off the ground. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit about meeting Charles and that shared vision that you had for the company early on.
Yes, of course. No, absolutely. The idea was born when Charles and I first met, and so how that came about from my perspective was that, as I mentioned, I had set my sights on starting a business, but I was quite rightly persuaded straight away after university to go and get a proper job. So I went into advertising for a couple of years. But I was still scribbling business plans at night and at weekends, and so after 2 years I stopped to pursue one of these, but sadly had no money. So I was also having to earn a bit of money on the side, to sort of fund these thoughts and plans. And in that time of earning some money, I met someone who had a brilliant idea, which was he started to register the old trademarks for the old East India Company. If you remember from the history books, an extraordinary company which was effectively the empire. And after the Indian Mutiny, the company was shut down by sort of government decree. And so all these trademarks had been lying there dormant. So anyway, he managed to get his hands on these. But then he was trying to work out how to apply them. And so it was in that point that I met him. And so I started to look at all things associated with the East India Company, from tea to coffee to spices to gemstone trading. But the area I got really interested in was drinks, because the East India Company invented IPA, India Pale Ale. They invented tonic water, Indian tonic water. And they were also the first people to export gin. And so it was that area that I really started to focus on. He stopped paying my consultancy fees. He'd run out of money. But I was very determined at that point that, there was such opportunity here. And it was gin that I was looking at really hard. And when I was talking to people in the gin trade, Charles's name came up a couple of times because Charles had done a fantastic job in resurrecting this old brand of gin called Plymouth Gin, which had been sort of overlooked and forgotten and sitting at the bottom of one of the big spirit companies' portfolio. He and a group had bought it, and he had injected this life in it, turned it around, and quite quickly another big spirit company come and bought it. And so when talking to people in the trade, they said, look, I think you should contact Charles because, I think he's looking for a new venture, and I think the two of you get on well. So that's how I ended up giving him a call, and we ended up having a cup of coffee. And the conversation started with gin, but very quickly it turned because Charles quite rightly said, look, I have just poured my life into this wonderful brand called Plymouth Gin. I don't want to compete with that. And the conversation turned then from gin to tonic, because I'd also been looking at that. Charles had himself, when he was running Plymouth, thought that there was a real opportunity in the world of tonic. And so this sort of very fortuitous meeting happened, this sort of meeting of minds, where it turns out we've both been thinking a very similar thing about this category and opportunity.
And that was because gin had obviously enjoyed this constant trend of premiumization, but tonic, and this was where your famous slogan comes from, tonic hadn't kept pace, which is why you were looking for something premium to pair with those quite expensive gins.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what we had seen was the fact that, premiumization was just starting to happen, just as you described here in the UK. In the world of gin, we're also seeing it in other spirit categories around the world. And the spirit companies were turning their time and attention to really wanting to market and tell the consumers all about this wonderful world of premium spirits, talking about provenance and ingredients. At the same time, the sort of bartending trade was starting to make a name for themselves. These fantastic cocktail bars were opening, and they were being termed mixologists. They were suddenly getting some press and coverage and interest and attention. So the world of cocktails was starting to come alive, and also we had seen how tax laws had started to change around the world, and so craft spirits was starting to appear. So all of this was happening in the world of spirits. And as far as we're concerned, it was right at the outset. There was no question in our mind this was going to continue. Yet in stark contrast, the mixer category had remained the preserve of one or two large global brands. In truth, I think they'd reveled in the fact that everyone's attention was elsewhere, and they had really been concentrating on manufacturing efficiencies and really, keeping their costs down. And we thought this is extraordinary because there were people prepared, willing, interested in spending money on these really good quality spirits, and at that point had no choice but to drown it with increasingly commoditized and artificial mixers. So that was the gap that we saw.
Absolutely. And I just wondered if we can digress just for a moment from the company's history, just to explore that partnership for a moment. I'm personally really interested in how a complementary set of not just skill sets and experience, but also complementary personalities, ways of thinking, can really help to cement a great partnership. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about you and Charles and how you interacted as people, and whether you feel that comment resonates with you.
Yeah, well, look, it's really interesting. I mean, we didn't know each other at all. As I say, that was a phone call on the suggestion of people in the trade. Charles is a few years older than me. We didn't have any kind of friends or, anyone in common. But we instantly got on very well. And, we instantly had this same sort of thought process. And I have to say, it was a fantastic collaboration. Whilst I remember at the time, investors always asking, well, what are the different skill sets? I mean, look, Charles had the benefit of a track record and some experience, and so that was fantastically helpful in the early days. I suppose I brought sort of energy and enthusiasm to it. But other than that, I think we had a very similar way of thinking. We never argued.
Which is amazing, really, in early days of setting up a business, which must have been stressful at
They
times.
They certainly were. But wow, as it made me think the strength of a partnership is so valuable. The old problem shared is a problem halved, and two heads better than one, and all these cliches I think are true. Because, as you say, it is stressful. You are making these, big decisions, and so it's fantastically helpful to have someone else there to discuss them with. And very grateful for the way that partnership panned out. We remain, extremely good friends.
Yes, I was going to ask, because he's no longer involved in the business, is he? Although he remains a sizable shareholder. But I was just wondering whether or not you stay in touch and still bounce ideas around between the two of you.
Yeah, we certainly stay in touch. In fact, I got an email from him this morning. And as you say, his remains a significant shareholder, a very, very interested shareholder, as you can imagine. So, we stay in touch, of course. But he quite rightly, a few years ago decided that now was a good time to go and enjoy the fruits of his labour. And whilst I was very sad to see him go, the great thing is that we'd built up a really fantastic team around us. So that's one of the things I think I'm almost proudest of is the brilliant group that we've sort of brought to bear on this business. And I maintain that we've got just about the best group in the whole of the drinks industry. So there are lots of people, lots of sounding boards now.
So let's talk about the early days of this group then, the early days of Fever Tree. And I think it's really hard when you read about those early days not to be struck by some quite extraordinary lengths that you went to in order to find those premium ingredients, the very best quality ingredients. And if I may just briefly quote from your website, they described that journey as, quote, an 18-month adventure from the archives of the British Library to facing the wrong end of a Kalashnikov in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that, to me, is definitely having echoes of what you said about your father with being chased by machete-wielding people in Yemen. So I was just thinking I would love to hear a little bit more about those early days and those adventures.
Yes, well, I mean, they turned out to be adventures. That wasn't the plan. But, what we decided to do, having, as I described, come up with, what we thought was this very obvious opportunity and gap in the market, was clearly we wanted to go and produce the very best quality products we possibly could. And so that's where we thought there should be absolutely no compromise. And we took a very different approach to product development. I mean, the usual thing is, the big companies call a flavor house, as they're called, and get them to send, some samples in quoting the price that they're prepared to pay, and that's the way it works. Whereas we said, no, we're going to go back, just as you say, into the history books to go and find out where you can go and source the highest quality, most authentic ingredients, and then go out and, see for ourselves and go and meet these suppliers. And so, just as you say, it has taken us, and certainly in those early days, but still does, to some extraordinary places around the world. Everything from, I think you mentioned before we started recording about lemonade. We sourced this amazing lemon from the foothills of Mount Etna in Sicily, which was a memorable trip. And we've got some gingers in front of us here, to some trips all around Africa and India to go and find ginger, to the story that you mentioned in the DRC, that was in pursuit of quinine. So Charles and I, actually quite separately, had read this same book called The Miraculous Fever Tree. And that was tracking the extraordinary history of quinine. But in it explained that there was one last remaining plantation of the highest quality quinine. But unfortunately, it happened to be in just about the most remote and lawless part of the world, which is the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So having read about this plantation, I then set off to go and meet them. To go and meet the plantation owners. And, to give you an idea of, quite how remote it is, just to get there, I had to fly from London to Nairobi to Kigali in Rwanda, and then persuade a local taxi driver to drive me the 8 hours across Rwanda. And that was just to get to the border. And then an idea of, unfortunately, how lawless it is that just the sort of 3 miles from the border to the doors of the plantation office, I got stopped 3 times. The first one was someone throwing a plank of wood out in front of the taxi with 6-inch nails in it, which is a very effective way to get you to stop. The second one, they didn't even bother with that. That was just a bit of string, but they were so well armed, you stopped anyway. And then the third one was certainly the one that's left quite an impression on me, was a young guy with a rocket launcher, over his shoulder. But it was worth it because, we still get, our quinine from this amazing plantation. And, we've forged a fantastic relationship with these guys, ever since as a result.
And you just gave us a little aside as well into the origins of the brand name, I guess, the fever tree, the eponymous fever tree.
Well, that's exactly right. And just to bore you for 1 minute is, the whole reason tonic water came about was because of quinine. So quinine comes from the bark of the fever tree. And it is this miraculous substance, hence this book we read about, The Miraculous Fever Tree, because it's considered still to this day one of the greatest medicinal discoveries in history. And that's because it's quinine that back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century stops you from catching malaria, or indeed cured you from malaria. And so it was the East India Company Army, the British troops in India, who used to give their troops a dose of quinine as their morning medicine. And if you've ever done as I have, which is try it raw, you realize quite how bitter it is. So, so quinine is that wonderful bitter flavor that you get in tonic water, which is, what sets tonic water apart. But in its raw form, it's extremely bitter. So understandably, those troops who were given this morning medicine, to help the medicine go down, as the expression came from it, they added sugar, water, the local botanicals and fruits, to help make their morning medicine palatable. And then also, the one thing the British always carried with them in the army at the time was a ration of gin. So they found they had their officers' permission to add gin to their morning medicine, and that is how gin and tonic was born.
Amazing. What an amazing story. Thank you, Tim. And we're going to perhaps come back to some of those ingredients when we talk about product innovation in a little while. But just in terms of those early days and rounding out that story. So we've talked a lot there actually about product development and the importance of those high quality ingredients. But what about commercial development? So once you felt that you'd finally got that recipe perfected and the right ingredients, how did you set about gaining commercial traction, going up against those dominant incumbents, or the one dominant incumbent, which had cornered the tonic market at that time? That can't have been easy.
No, and it wasn't. So we had our product that we're incredibly proud of. As you said, it took us 18 months to develop. And then, of course, we needed to go and sell it. But again, our whole mantra has always been, and we still try and cling on to it, to continue to do what the big players don't or aren't necessarily quite so focused or interested on. And what usually happens is, the big soft drink guys, they come up with a new product, they do a big above the line marketing campaign, and then they give it to their big retail customers to try and get traction as quickly as possible to meet their minimum order quantities at production. But we took a different view. We decided what we wanted to do was just target the high-end hotel, bar, restaurant trade. Because we felt that we wanted those opinion formers. I suppose they're the old-fashioned influencers, really. We wanted to get them to taste our product, understand the product differential, understand the lengths we've been to, and why this was so important. This had been this overlooked, forgotten category. And we wanted, to people to realize what a fundamental part of the drink it was. And so it was quite a lot of old-fashioned shoe leather, going from door to door, bar to bar, restaurant to restaurant, to meet these bartenders, to get them to taste the product, to get them to see the benefit it could, bring their drinks and their experience for their customers. And so that's how we went about it. And so quite a long-winded process.
But then they can be your advocates, presumably.
And they turned into our advocates, and proved incredibly valuable in the development of the business. And it still sits at the heart of the way we launch our products when we go to new markets is, we go and see that top end of the trade first and really get them to understand, what we've done and the benefit that we can bring.
A genuinely aspirational brand, I suppose, if you want to see it that way. I read, actually, really interestingly, that I can't remember the name of the patron. You probably can. I'm sure you can, Tim. But the patron of El Bulli, the best restaurant in the world, certainly at the time, had made a granita, I think it was, out of Fever Tree tonic, which is, there's not many more amazing accolades for the quality of your ingredients than that.
Well, it's kind of you to mention that story because, yes, it was a fantastic bit of good luck. The one thing you realise is when starting a business, you need a bit of good luck along the way. And that was certainly it as far as we were concerned, because it was an extraordinary tale about how the fact that he had been given a bottle of our tonic water by, actually it turned out to be quite a famous British artist. And so Ferran, who, as you say, at the time was just about the most revered gastronome in the world, presiding over this amazing restaurant, El Bulli, that had been nominated Best Restaurant for 5 years on the trot. And this famous artist knew that Ferran loved a gin and tonic. And so he sent him out a bottle of Fever Tree from the UK. And the first thing we heard about it was a phone call that we got from the sommelier at El Bulli. And the call, said, look, he would love to meet you and Charles. Any chance you could come out to visit? So of course, this is a restaurant that at that point had a 5-year waiting list. So we didn't hesitate. But the reason Ferran was keen to meet was he had made Fever Tree not only into the aperitivo drink that you got when you arrived at El Bulli, this sort of wonderful gin and tonic, but also he made it into one of the dishes in his world-famous tasting menu. So as you quite rightly say, this granita, this Super de Fever Tree tonic. And so that was a glorious moment, sitting there eating our tonic water in these wonderful surroundings in the best restaurant in the world. And it's really resonated with the chef community, the fact that, he had gone to these lengths to source this tonic water, and this was the tonic water of his choice. So no question, that was a fantastic advocate and help to the brand in those early days.
Yes, absolutely. And what about the funding journey along the way? If you can tell us a little bit about how you funded those earlier stages of growth. I think at some point you took VC investment for the first time a couple of years into the journey. If you tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, I mean, I like to think we've been through sort of every form of funding, actually. So, right at the outset, Charles put a bit of money in, which from his Plymouth Gin funds. I sadly had nothing but student loans to offer at the time. We also took in a bit of angel money then. And then after 18 months or so, when we realized we were starting to get a bit of traction and some, real customers on board, we decided to take in some venture capital. And we took in this venture capital on the promise that they would leave us alone and keep us at arm's length, and they were true to their word for the first 5 years. And then they realized that I think some polo ponies needed stabling and some divorces needed settling and school fees needed paying, and so they were hunting around to see what they could divest, and they came across us in one of their funds. And I tell that tale because it was quite prescient, because it created a very difficult year, because they were just there to try and maximize the value, whatever that may have been from selling the business through. And, we were desperate for that not to be the result.
Including potentially a sale of the whole business.
Yeah. And so we then went into private equity. So they got a very satisfactory return, but we only went into private equity relatively briefly for sort of 18 months or so, because by then we were aware of the perils of having one significant shareholder. And so we were the ones actually that wanted to float the business, and which was only good news as far as our private equity guys were concerned, because they made this fantastic, very fast return. But yes, so we went venture capital, private equity, and then floated the business.
Which was in 2014.
2014.
So just over a decade ago. And I think it's probably fair to say you've been through your fair share of euphoric highs and quite challenging lows with regard to the share price. But I wondered whether or not you can tell us whether or not you still think it was the right decision for the business. Would you do it again if you had your time again?
Well, I think you can only judge it on the circumstances at the time. And so I've given you the sort of background as to why we were keen to float it. And so I think that was certainly the right decision then. And look, I think broadly speaking, I mean, it slightly depends me on which day you ask, but broadly speaking, I think it's been very good for us. It's given us a sort of public profile. It's got us as part of the news agenda, which is a small consumer brand, is hard to achieve. And as you say, we went through a fantastic growth period. I mean, the business has grown very considerably, since we floated. And so we've garnered, great headlines as a result. So I think that's all been very positive. Of course, it comes with regulation and reporting requirements, but on balance, I think we would have made the same decision again.
It's really good to hear that. I think one criticism that's quite often thrown at the stock market is that it can be very short-termist. So, when we're trading off between the short-term advantages of maximising profit in any given year, and actually owner-managers of businesses so often, such as you're giving us all of this chat right now on the podcast, but want to maximise value over the really long term. And there can be that sort of fundamental tension for businesses listed on the market. Do you feel that?
Well, what I would say is I think it's got more short term. We've been listed now for 10 years, and I have really seen that over the last 2 or 3 years. And that is a concern. Because, as you say, one of the things that was sold to us about being a public company was the fact that you could find great long-term shareholders. And we have them. I mean, Lion Trust is one. Lindsay Trainer, fantastic sort of long-term shareholders. We absolutely have them on our register. But they're proving a little harder to find now than they were a few years ago. So that is a concern. But, I'm hoping it's something that, the market can address.
Yes, you and we too. So let's talk a little bit about where the business is today. I think it's really clear whenever we talk to you that relentless flavour innovation, product innovation that we've touched upon in the early stages of the podcast definitely remains the lifeblood of the business today. But how about the process of developing new flavours? Do you still get involved personally in that?
Very, very. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best bit of the job and the best bit of the business. I mean, you walked past on your way in a small lab that we've got here. I spend an awful lot of time in that lab. I mean, an example we touched on before we started recording one of our newest products, an espresso martini. That turned out to be an enormous labour of love. If we actually did, I think at the last count, and I was involved in each and every one, 154 different versions and tastings, which left me flying very high on the back of the amount of caffeine involved. But yeah, so it really does remain absolutely at the heart of what we do and what I do, in the business today. And I do think in the end it is the single most important thing and what distinguishes us from the competition.
So let's have a little go at this, because I know you mentioned earlier that you've got 3 different types of ginger in front of us here. And I have to give a bit of a caveat that I definitely wouldn't win any prizes for my olfactory system. As I was reading this quite terrifying story earlier today when I was Googling about tasting. And there was a story about how a famous wine tasting connoisseur had been insured for millions of pounds because their nose and their and their senses of taste and smell were so precious. Now, I'm definitely not going to win any prizes for that, but I'll give it my best shot, Tim, if we have a little go.
Look, now, this is a tasting that I have forced on so many people over the years. In fact, when we floated the business, we insisted that all of the fund managers we sat in front of did this tasting, because I think it's all very well me sitting here telling you what great products we have, but there's nothing like proof in the pudding. So look, I won't name them, but I've got, one of the main competitors. This is ginger ale we're tasting here. So, Tori, if I can encourage you, taste the Fever Tree one, and then go back to that. And I'd be interested in your reaction. But perhaps it will allow me, whilst you're doing that, to give you a view of a bloke called David Broom on the subject of famous palates. So this guy is well known as one of the great whiskey connoisseurs in the world and one of the great sort of authorities on whiskey. So Charles and I got him to do this tasting when we first developed it. And he tried that one, he tried ours, and tried that one again. And he slammed his fist on the desk. And he said, "This is an outrage." And we were terribly worried he was talking about our product. But he goes, "No, they have taken ginger out of ginger ale. And so if you try that one back again," as he said, "this is nothing more than brown Sprite." And this is the point. This is the situation that the mixer category had got themselves into, where it had been so stripped of cost and with it flavour that actually it wasn't even, the product that it set out to be. So hence, we set out to put real ginger back in. And what I've got 3 different gingers, because in our ginger ale we use 3 different types of ginger. So I just wanted to show you this wonderful world and variety that there is in the world of ginger. Most people think of ginger, at best they think of the fresh ginger that you can buy in the supermarkets. But make no mistake, that ginger is sold on weight. And that is actually usually Chinese ginger, which is pumped full of lots of water, hence its heavier weight. So actually, whilst that's fresh version is a good version, it's still not the intense version that you can find out there. So look, I'm just going to ask you just to smell. This is ginger from the wonderful Cochin Hills, which I was out last year with our ginger supplier. And so that should give you this kind of rich...
It's almost chocolatey.
Chocolatey,
actually.
Exactly. There we go. You
Strangely.
see, your nose is as good as anyone else's.
Well, I'm not sure
and
about
then
that.
this one is this discovery of ours is fresh green
That's
ginger.
zingy. That's what I think of as ginger. That
and gives you this sort of citrus burst.
absolutely.
And that is because we use this fresh ginger, which no one else uses in soft drinks. So it's extracted as soon as it comes out of the ground. And then this one is from Nigeria. So this is a sort of more earthy style.
Yes, more similar in style to the first one.
To the first one. But look, that's the variety of ginger there is out there. And these are the three, a blend of, that we use in our ginger ale, and then even more intensely in our ginger beer.
And are they oils, Tim?
So those are oils,
Yes. Like essential oils. They look like essential oils for our listeners when I'm looking at them. And funnily enough, when Tim just opened those 3 little bottles, I can already smell it filling the air between our microphones.
Well, quite. And actually, I remember, very early on in one of the hotels going to, sell my wares and doing this very tasting to them. One of the sommeliers was so delighted he started dabbing these ginger oils, on him, under his ears. He loved the smell of it so much.
Well, you can certainly taste the product of that care and attention that's given to the ingredients in the ginger ale. I mean, I think brown Sprite is probably quite a good description of the, let's call it the mainstream product that we have in front of us. And in yours, you can taste a real depth and complexity of flavour. But yes, I wouldn't want to be trying to tell you what exactly it is I'm tasting. But yeah, the chocolatiness, the zingy citrus freshness, I can definitely get a lot of that through.
Fantastic.
So we talked a little bit about the flavour innovation. What about the popularity of gin? Because I think a lot of people or a lot of the analysts out there in the market have been talking increasingly about the importance of your breadth of product for the future growth prospects of the company. Gin, like so many other things, has definitely experienced a very long moment in the sun, actually, in terms of its popularity. But it appears that its popularity is starting to wane, and then with it, you've got the increasing popularity of other spirits, rum in particular, tequila. Can you talk to us a bit about how you see that and how important the diversification strategy of the company is with regard to the product set?
Yes, well, as you say, the breadth, I think you quoted it when you were talking about your Ocado order at the beginning. We have very purposely set out to build a broad range of products to ensure that we've got a fantastic product to go with all of the different spirits that are out there. Because, as you say, gin here in the UK has had this fantastic time in the sun renaissance. It's gone through this extraordinary growth. And whilst that's coming off, it still remains a very big, very important, very premium category with, wonderful, loyal consumers. So very important to the business. But at the same time, we're seeing tequila, which has gone through a similar growth in the US. And we've been a great beneficiary of that because we've got this wonderful pink grapefruit to make this delicious Paloma drink. We've got our margarita mix to make a fantastic margarita. Yeah, thumbs up from Victoria there. You can't see it, sadly. But so, our whole plan is to ensure the fact that we've got the right products for these different spirits, because this is what's exciting about the world of spirits, is that it's growing and growing in terms of the premium end of the category, but also in terms of the breadth, in terms of the new spirits that are coming to market. And as I said earlier, fueled by, these fantastic cocktail bars and cocktail barmen and mixologists around the world. So, spirits is set to continue to grow and grow. But the great thing about it for Fever-Tree is the spirit producers and the consumers want to promote it and drink it long and mixed. No longer do people want to drink it neat or just over ice into anything like the same degree. So this is what's exciting for us, is we find ourselves in this ever-growing category that's continuing to premiumize and continuing to want to be mixed. And we sit at the heart of this.
Yeah, and you've got a really interesting, fresh approach to marketing as well, because so much of your marketing is based around doing joint co-promotions with those large spirits companies to promote things like the Paloma cocktail, for example. Whose idea was that?
Well, I mean, it was, natural as far as we were concerned to go and talk to the spirit companies to say, hey, guys, look, we're selling a finished drink here. There's no point us, promoting this separately. We should be promoting this together. But as I described, the great thing is that as everyone's wanted to drink their spirits mixed, they actually have also been coming to us, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, saying that actually it's essential that we are part of their marketing and promotion, because this is how ultimately people are going to drink the drink. And so, yes, so it's always been a backbone to the way we go about, pushing and promoting the product. And it's something, our customers, as in the retailers, are very keen on, because they realize that, putting these products together at point of fixture in the store means that the consumer is much more likely to pick them up and then drink them. And so their sales go up and their replenishment of those drinks go up. And also it's something we work incredibly hard with the on-trade over. So we were the first to get in there and do gin and tonic menus for them here in the UK. But now we do spritz menus, cocktail menus, mule menus, a whole variety, because actually making this easy for the consumer is clearly what encourages them to sample and drink and then drink again.
Yeah, absolutely. And widening the appeal of the spirit, I suppose, to encompass more drinking occasions. I mean, it's not that often or that frequently that we sit at home and drink neat spirits, but actually a spirit mixed into a long drink has much broader appeal.
No, you're exactly right. This is the other thing, of course, the spirit companies have realized. It means you can drink these things, at lunchtime, aperitivo time, during dinner, after dinner, late into the night. So you're right. It suddenly gives, spirits this greater breadth.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk quickly about geographic expansion. You've managed to build a very dominant position within your more mature markets. I mean, none more so than the UK, where I think you enjoy around about a 45% market share, which has grown from about 5% in just over a decade, which is a remarkable achievement. But a key component of the growth story, because your core market, your historic market is so well penetrated, is clearly trying to then replicate that success overseas in territories like the US, Europe, different European countries, the Far East, Australia. So before we get on to the opportunity there, maybe you can tell us quickly about the first steps that you took to expand the business overseas.
Yes, well, sort of unusually as a startup, we did it very early on. And that's because we realized, once we'd had this idea and really started to explore the opportunity, that we were the first people to think about this, not just here in the UK, but actually, as it turns out, anywhere in the world. And so even as a sort of very lightly funded startup, we set off to go, and I always sort of describe it as plant our flag in the key spirit markets around the world, because we wanted the trade to realize that, we were the first mover. We were the original pioneer of this whole premium mixer movement. And so, we started to, launch overseas after 18 months. And Spain, I talked about our introduction there with El Bulli, which was fantastic. But, the US, and I actually moved my family out there in 2008. I mean, we launched in 2007 to get right behind the launch, because we always thought that was going to be, in time, the most important market. Charles moved out to Spain at one point, to give that a real push. I mean, so international expansion was on our horizon from very, very early on.
Right. And in terms of that US opportunity, I mean, we're at a really fascinating juncture, actually, in the company's growth, for future growth, because one of the most recent developments in the equity story is the announcement of the signing of a transformational partnership, a strategic partnership with Molson Coors, the brewer in the United States, whereby Molson Coors took an 8.5% equity stake in Fever-Tree and signed an exclusive deal to sell, distribute, and produce Fever-Tree products in the US to turbocharge the medium to longer term growth in the territory. So perhaps, and I appreciate you could probably talk about this for hours, but in a pithy way, please could you tell us a little bit about what you think that partnership's going to do for Fever-Tree in terms of turbocharging the US growth story?
Yeah, look, I think it's a sort of pivotal moment in some ways in the whole Fever-Tree story, but certainly the one in the US. As I mentioned, the US was a very, very early focus of ours, and we have grown that business very well over the years. We set up our own business in 2018. And, in these last 6 years, we've grown it, a CAGR of 24%, so really strong growth. And not only that, we've got ourselves into be the leader of the tonic and the ginger beer category, and by far the leader of the premium mixer category there. So got ourselves in this fantastic position. And that's why Molson Coors came knocking on the door, because they've got a very public strategy to expand their business beyond beer into the non-alcoholic world, and they see Fever-Tree as the flag bearer in that strategy, and it's very exciting for us because they're nice people. We spent a year or so talking about this and getting to the right terms on the deal and the approach. We're very impressed by their plans and their ambitions for the brand. But, ultimately they come with this fantastic reach and scale and muscle. There's not a corner of the US that they don't sell to. But not only that, is also they open up a couple of very valuable channels for us. So the whole world of convenience in the US, which means that we can really expand our soft drink plans and ambitions. And also through that same channel, they sell ready-to-drinks. And that's an area that we've always believed that it would be a very natural place for us to develop our range into in time. So they bring scale, but they bring new channels, new opportunities, and then, as you mentioned in the summary, they also bring production skills and capabilities, which means that they really are the perfect partner for us, and we're very excited about the future opportunity together.
Yeah, and it's hugely exciting to have a partner with such distribution clout, I think. But one thing that has hugely frustrated me in terms of the commentary in the market around it is that so many have focused on the short-term, brief impact to profitability over a 2-year time horizon, whereby you and Molson Coors will be jointly investing behind the brand to push the distribution. And many people are taking that as a signal to be somewhat less excited about that longer term potential. So to me, as a long-term equity holder of the company, this is a really exciting moment, and increasing investment for longer term return makes perfect sense. As a fellow equity holder of the business, we have similar sized stakes actually in the business. Yours is slightly bigger than ours. How do you feel about that trade-off?
Look, I share your frustration. In fact, I share not just your frustration, but I'm amazed about it because, this really is a fantastic deal for both sides. And the opportunity that it will open up is really significant, which is, I know, what the investment community have been desperate for. And also we've been under pressure's probably too strong a word, but questioning as to when we're going to invest more to drive growth. So we explain we're going to do that as well. But then at the same time, we say, obviously, naturally, that means you've got to give it 18 months before you start to see the return. And so that's why I'm amazed that, there can be any kind of criticism about that. But I'm afraid that's something, as you said earlier on, the sort of short-term nature of the market, and why, as I said, I've seen more of that recently. You've just got to accept and realize that, for all of those, there are plenty of people who see the long-term opportunity this presents, and that's who you've got to spend your time going to talk to.
And in a sense, that's part of the reason behind this whole podcast series. It's to try and give our listeners of all types, a bit of an insight into the way that the entrepreneurs who are building businesses for the long term think about achieving those ambitions, and sometimes a mentality of investment for the medium to longer term health of the business, is absolutely the right way to go, even if in the short term that means that there will be an impact on, this year's EPS.
Yes. Yeah.
And if I may, I'll ask a very theoretical question, and deliberately theoretical here, but is that an approach, that strategic partnership approach, that could be replicated in other territories, exciting growth territories across the globe?
Yes, I mean, it hasn't escaped the attention of the trade, the announcement of this deal. But this is something clearly that, we will be looking hard at. But, we already have some great partners. I mean, I've been on my travels recently. I mean, I was in Spain last week, where our partner is Estrella Damm, a very strong, powerful beer business in Spain. They also are looking beyond beer to drive their business, and so we sit there with them. The week before that, I was in Japan with Asahi, another very strong, powerful beer business, also who is very focused on life beyond beer, and so have chosen Fever-Tree to be their partner there to help drive that business, that very substantial business in Japan. So we've got some great partners, but there's no question that this has raised our profile yet again on the sort of drink stage, and it'd be interesting to see the conversations that follow.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tim, I wondered if I can take you into a bit of kind of questions about personal resilience, because despite all the exciting developments that we've been talking about and all the wonderful parts of your job, like so many other businesses over recent years, it hasn't all been smooth sailing for Fever-Tree. You've had to cope with, the challenges of the COVID pandemic, the resulting inflationary pressures, geopolitical tensions. Now, clearly, we have a mixed consumer demand backdrop to contend with as well around the world. But what I wanted to ask you was how you remain resilient in the face of such challenges, because clearly, as the person at the helm of the business, I'm sure that sometimes those pressures take their toll.
Yeah, I mean, as you illustrate, it has been an extraordinarily tough 5 years. But when you talk about resilience, I mean, in truth, is nothing like when you're starting a business and everyone's telling you you're mad, and there's no opportunity. What on earth are you thinking? That took a different type of resilience.
None of the investors are going at you with rocket launchers.
Yeah, quite. But what I would say is I'm pretty proud of the way we have, and I say we, I'm talking collectively here, not me, but, the broader business and board as well have managed these last 5 years. In COVID, we took the decision not to furlough anyone, despite the fact, lots of, our competition were. But that's despite the fact that we sell a lot to the hotel, bar, restaurant trade and have people obviously dedicated to that arm of the business. And our view is we wanted to keep servicing them as best we could. They needed support then more than ever, and that has really benefited us. As soon as we opened up, you talked about our market share that we now enjoy. We saw that really grow. And more recently, with the extraordinary growth in costs. There were quite a lot of, back to our short-term, investor pressures to just pass that through to consumers, just to increase our price, considerably. And we were very adamant that was absolutely the wrong thing to do. We know we'd done this amazing job about building this fantastic customer base. The last thing we want to do is alienate great swathes of them by just driving the price up. And again, I think, we're already seeing it in terms of our continued growth in market share, that was the right strategy. So I think we've had to be resilient on that front to, quite a few of the sort of short-term requests and desires. And so we now find ourselves, in a stronger position in terms of market share, and size of business and position around the world. And then in this increasingly valuable position where it's not just the mixed drink opportunity that is in front of us, But, this whole world of non-alcoholic and adult soft drinks that, we sit here as a brand, brilliantly, beautifully positioned to make the most of, and almost unique in that sense. So I think it's going to prove the fact that, we've come through much stronger with a greater opportunity ahead of us than ever before. But there were certainly some testing times along the way.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wondered if, we're coming to a close on the podcast shortly, but I wondered if I could ask you a couple more questions. The first is really, it's A, to ask your opinion, but B, to ask some advice. What I want to know is, obviously, with your position, with the household brand you've built up and a fascinating backstory to it, it's going to be inspirational for budding entrepreneurs out there to hear you tell your story. But do you think on the whole we're good in the UK at nurturing entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, at creating those conditions where the founders of businesses, small businesses, can thrive? Or could we do a lot better? What could we do better is perhaps a better way of asking it, to inspire the next generation.
Well, I mean, that's a far-reaching question. And what I would say is, look, I think, of course, we can do a better job about banging the drum of our homegrown successes. I don't think that necessarily comes naturally to Britain. I don't think it naturally comes to the media either in the way that perhaps it could and should. But I think, it's the government that should be doing all they can, to bang the drum of, British success stories. I think they should be favouring them when it comes to tenders. I think they should be really taking this story around the world. They've got this amazing network of embassies. I think they should be there acting as great ambassadors of British business. I travel a lot and go to lots of events and lots of trade shows, and I think lots of other countries do it a lot better. And so I really do believe that's part of the responsibility of government, is to be banging the drum about British business. So I think they can do that an awful lot better.
Thank you very much. And so, final question, I've been asking this to all my guests on the podcast, but what I really want to know from entrepreneurs is that we talk to so many people who've got these amazing stories to tell. They've obviously reached a real pinnacle of their careers. But what I want to know is, what would they do if they could just exchange places with somebody just for a day to see what it's like in somebody else's shoes? So my question to you is, if you could exchange places with any other person in any other career just for a single day, who would that be and why?
Well, I've got a very immediate answer to that question, because I've got an immediate need. And that is the fact I've got a small holding with some sheep that are just about to be lambing, and a couple of cows that are about to be calving. And I have no knowledge or experience of this, and it's coming at me quite fast. So I would love to exchange places with a farmer for a day to desperately get some hands-on experience, because, as I say, I'm 3 weeks off. I'm just learning what I can by YouTube at night, but I can see that I need a bit more practical experience and advice than that.
Watching some Jeremy Clarkson, Warrillow's Farm. You heard it here first.
It's a very small version.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Tim. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. And for our listeners, please do subscribe via Spotify, Apple, or your usual podcast provider. As always, please remember, nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or a solicitation to purchase securities in any company or investment product mentioned. See you next time.